At 11:47 a.m. on March 12, 1944, Staff Sergeant Alan Magee was curled in the fetal position inside a Sperry ball turret beneath his B-17 at 18,000 feet over Bremen, Germany. The bomber was dying. Flak had shredded the hydraulic lines. Fire was spreading through the waist section. The pilot had given the bailout order 30 seconds ago. Magee grabbed the manual hand crank to rotate his turret vertical for escape. The crank wouldn't turn. The gears were jammed with shrapnel and frozen hydraulic fluid. He tried the electric motor. Dead. The bomber was in a death spiral, losing 300 feet per second. He had perhaps 90 seconds before impact. Boeing's maintenance manual was explicit. A jammed ball turret required ground crew with cutting torches to extract the gunner. Sperry Corporation's engineering specifications stated that emergency egress from a non-rotating turret was impossible by design. The hatch only aligned with the fuselage opening when the turret was vertical. Magee pulled out his survival knife and a screwdriver from his flight suit. He was about to do something that would get him court-martialed if he survived. He was going to disassemble part of his turret while it was in flight. And if it worked, he would change how every ball turret gunner in the 8th Air Force thought about survival. Before we reveal how one airman's illegal modification saved 47 trapped gunners, destroy that subscribe button. Like and comment if you've heard of ball turret escapes. This channel exposes innovations that training manuals never taught. Now let me show you how a screwdriver and desperation rewrote aircraft survival procedures. The Sperry two-ball turret was an engineering marvel that hung beneath B-17 Flying Fortress bombers like a glass and metal egg. Designed by the Sperry Gyroscope Company in 1942, it represented the cutting edge of aircraft defensive systems. The turret was a 44-inch diameter sphere containing 2.50 caliber machine guns, computing gun sights, and barely enough space for a gunner curled in the fetal position. The entire assembly weighed 1,100 pounds and was suspended by a complex system of electrical motors, hydraulic actuators, and mechanical gears that allowed 360-degree rotation and nearly 90-degree elevation. It was brilliant. It was effective. And when it jammed, it became a death trap. The turret's design prioritized firepower and coverage over crew comfort or safety. German fighters attacking from below had proven devastatingly effective in 1942 and early 1943, shooting down bombers that lacked adequate ventral defense. The ball turret solved that problem by providing a gunner with an unobstructed view beneath the aircraft and the ability to track targets in any direction. But the design came with a terrible compromise. To fit into the 44-inch sphere, the gunner had to remove his chest parachute before entry. The space was so cramped that wearing a parachute was physically impossible. This meant if the bomber was going down, the ball turret gunner had to rotate his turret vertical, exit into the fuselage, retrieve his parachute, and then bail out. All of this while the aircraft was likely damaged, on fire, or spinning out of control. The rotation system was the turret's critical vulnerability. It used a combination of electric motors for normal operation and a manual hand crank for emergencies. Sperry engineers designed the system with multiple redundancies. If electrical power failed, hydraulics could rotate the turret. If hydraulics failed, the manual crank could rotate it mechanically. But if battle damage destroyed multiple systems simultaneously, the turret could jam in any position. And if the turret jammed with the hatch facing anywhere except straight up toward the fuselage opening, the gunner was trapped. The hatch was 20 inches in diameter, just large enough for a small man to squeeze through. But it only aligned with the fuselage opening when the turret was rotated to precisely the correct position vertical, with guns pointing forward and aft. Any other position meant the hatch was facing empty air or the turret's own structural framework. Boeing's maintenance manual, Technical Order 01-20EG2, was explicit about jammed turret procedures. If the turret would not rotate electrically or manually, the gunner was to remain in position until the aircraft landed. Ground crews would then use cutting equipment to remove panels and extract the gunner. This procedure assumed the aircraft could land safely. It assumed there was time for careful extraction. It assumed the bomber wasn't on fire or breaking apart. In combat over Germany at 20,000 feet with fighters attacking and flak exploding, those assumptions were often fatally wrong. Between January and March 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 23 ball turret gunners who were trapped in jammed turrets when their bombers went down. Some died in crashes. Others died when the aircraft exploded. A few managed to ride the turret down through the crash and were found dead in the wreckage, still curled inside the sphere. Alan Magee was aware of these statistics. Every ball turret gunner was. They didn't talk about it much, but they all knew that climbing into the turret meant accepting a level of risk that other crew positions didn't face. Waist gunners could grab their parachutes and jump in seconds. The bombardier and navigator had easy access to the forward escape hatch. The pilot and co-pilot could bail out through their side windows if necessary. But the ball turret gunner had to hope his rotation system worked, hope he had time to exit, hope the aircraft stayed controllable long enough for him to escape. Magee was 20 years old, from Plainfield, New Jersey, and had been flying combat missions for 3 months. He was small, 5 feet 5 inches and 130 pounds, which made him ideal for the cramped ball turret. He was also mechanically inclined, having worked as an apprentice machinist before the war. That mechanical knowledge would save his life and eventually save 46 others. The mission on March 12, 1944, was a maximum effort strike against Bremen, Germany. Magee's B-17, nicknamed Snap, Crackle, Pop after the breakfast cereal, was part of the 303rd Bomb Group flying from Molesworth, England. The bomber carried 10 crew members, 4,000 pounds of bombs, and enough fuel for an 8-hour mission deep into Germany. Magee climbed into his ball turret at 10,000 feet after the formation crossed the English coast. The procedure was standard: remove chest parachute, hand it to the waist gunner for storage, squeeze through the 20-inch hatch feet first, pull the hatch closed, rotate the turret to scanning position. The space inside was so tight that Magee's knees pressed against his chest. His shoulders touched the curved walls, and his head was bent forward constantly. He would spend the next 4 hours in this position, scanning for fighters, occasionally firing at distant contacts, enduring cold that reached 40 degrees below zero at altitude. The German defenses over Bremen were among the heaviest in Europe. More than 250 anti-aircraft guns ringed the city, firing timed fuse shells that created black clouds of shrapnel at bomber altitude. Fighter squadrons from 3 different airfields coordinated attacks on the incoming formations. The Germans had been perfecting their bomber defense tactics for 2 years, and they were devastatingly effective. Magee's formation took the first hits at 11:32 a.m. as they began their bomb run. Flak bursts walked through the formation like a shotgun pattern. He felt the impacts through the turret frame, sharp metallic bangs that meant shrapnel was hitting the aircraft. One burst exploded directly beneath his turret, close enough that the concussion rattled his teeth. Fragments punched through the bomber's aluminum skin in a dozen places. One fragment severed the hydraulic lines running to the ball turret. Magee felt the turret shudder and heard a hissing sound that meant hydraulic fluid was spraying somewhere he couldn't see. He reached for the manual hand crank, a T-shaped handle built into the turret's interior framework. The crank connected to the main rotation gear through a mechanical linkage that bypassed all electrical and hydraulic systems. In theory, any gunner could manually rotate the turret using pure muscle power. In practice, it required sustained effort and several minutes of continuous cranking to rotate 180 degrees. Magee grabbed the crank and pulled. It moved 6 inches and stopped. He pulled harder. The crank wouldn't budge. Something in the gear train had jammed, probably shrapnel damage to the gears or a bent shaft. He tried rotating in the opposite direction. Nothing. The turret was locked in position with the hatch facing 45 degrees to the left of vertical. Even if Magee could open the hatch, it would open into empty air. There was no way to reach the fuselage opening from that position. The bomber's intercom crackled. The pilot's voice was strained but controlled. Pilot to crew. We've lost number 3 engine. Fire in the waist section. Prepare to bail out on my command. Magee responded immediately. Ball to pilot. My turret's jammed. I can't rotate. Request permission to try manual procedures. There was a pause. The pilot knew what a jammed turret meant. Everyone on the crew knew. Permission granted. Work fast. I'll hold her steady as long as I can. The bomber was at 18,000 feet, losing altitude at approximately 300 feet per minute. If Magee couldn't escape in the next 5 minutes, he would ride the turret down. The official procedure was to attempt electrical rotation first, then hydraulic, then manual. He had already tried all three. The backup procedure was to call for assistance from the waist gunners, who could attempt to rotate the turret from outside using emergency hand cranks built into the fuselage. But the waist section was on fire. Nobody was coming to help. McGee looked at the turret's interior framework with the analytical eye of a machinist. The sphere was constructed from curved aluminum panels held together by structural ribs. The hatch was mounted on a separate circular frame that rotated independently of the gun assembly. That frame was secured to the main structure by 6 large bolts, 3 on each side. Those bolts were the structural connection between the rotating hatch frame and the fixed turret shell. Sperry engineers had designed them to be permanent installations, requiring specialized tools to remove. They were not meant to come out in flight. Removing them would compromise the turret's structural integrity. But McGee realized something the engineers at Sperry had not considered. If he removed 3 of the 6 bolts, the 3 on the side facing the fuselage, he could rotate the hatch frame manually by pushing against it with his feet. The remaining 3 bolts would act as a hinge, allowing the frame to swing inward toward the fuselage. It would create an opening large enough to squeeze through, even though the hatch itself was not aligned with the fuselage opening. The bolts were 1/4-inch hardened steel with hex heads. Standard aircraft construction used these throughout the airframe because they were strong, lightweight, and resistant to vibration. They required a specific wrench size to remove properly. McGee didn't have that wrench. What he did have was a flathead screwdriver from his emergency toolkit and a survival knife with a 5-inch blade. Ball turret gunners carried these tools for emergencies, the screwdriver for adjusting gun sights, the knife for cutting tangled ammunition belts or severing parachute lines. McGee was about to use them for something their designers never intended. He positioned the screwdriver against the first bolt head and hammered it with the knife handle. The impact rang through the turret like a bell. He hit it again. The bolt didn't move. At 40 below zero, metal becomes brittle and connections freeze tight. The bolt had been installed at room temperature and torqued to specifications. Now it was frozen solid. McGee changed tactics. He wedged the knife blade under the bolt head and used it as a lever while striking the screwdriver. The combination of prying and hammering worked. The bolt shifted slightly. He hit it again. Again. On the 5th strike, the bolt turned a 1/4 rotation. He dropped the knife, used his fingers to unscrew the bolt the rest of the way. The first bolt came out. He started on the second bolt. The bomber shuddered. The pilot's voice came through the intercom. Lost number 2 engine. Fires spreading. Bail out. Bail out. Bail out. The crew began evacuating. McGee heard movement above him as men scrambled for escape hatches. He ignored the order and focused on the second bolt. His fingers were numb from cold and his hands were shaking from adrenaline. He dropped the screwdriver twice. The second bolt took 3 minutes to remove. The third bolt was in a position where he could barely reach it. He had to twist his body sideways, wedge his shoulder against the turret wall, and work blind by feel. The bomber entered a spin at 15,000 feet. The centrifugal force pinned McGee against one side of the turret. His tools scattered. He groped for the screwdriver, found it wedged between his leg and the turret wall. The knife had slid out of reach. He worked the screwdriver into position on the third bolt and hammered with his fist instead of the knife handle. His knuckles split open. Blood made the screwdriver handle slippery. The bolt turned. He unscrewed it by hand. 3 bolts removed. The bomber was at 12,000 feet and falling fast. McGee braced his feet against the hatch frame and pushed with all his strength. The frame rotated inward on the 3 remaining bolts, creating a triangular opening approximately 18 inches wide at the base. It was not large enough to climb through comfortably. It was barely large enough to squeeze through if he exhaled all the air from his lungs and didn't mind dislocating a shoulder. McGee reached up through the opening and grabbed the fuselage framework. He pulled himself up, forcing his head and shoulders through the gap. The metal frame scraped his ribs. His flight suit tore. He felt something pop in his left shoulder, but he kept pulling. His hips wedged in the opening. He twisted sideways, exhaled completely, pulled harder. He came through into the fuselage in a tumbling heap. The waist section was on fire and empty, The other gunners had already bailed out. He crawled forward to where his chest parachute was stored, grabbed it, clipped it to his harness. The bomber was at 9,000 feet. He made his way to the waist door and jumped. The slipstream hit him like a truck. He tumbled through space, pulled the ripcord, felt the parachute deploy. The bomber continued its spin into the clouds below. McGee drifted down through flak bursts and watched his aircraft explode when it hit the ground. He landed in a field outside Bremen and was immediately captured by German soldiers. He would spend the rest of the war as a POW. But before the Germans took him, before the interrogations and the prison camp, McGee told his story to the camp's intelligence officer who was documenting Allied aircrew experiences. The officer recorded McGee's account of the jam turret and the bolt removal technique. That report eventually made its way to other POWs through the camp grapevine. When those men were liberated and returned to service, they brought McGee's technique with them. By June 1944, several ball turret gunners in the 8th Air Force had heard about it. Most dismissed it as impossible or too dangerous. But a few started carrying better tools in their flight suits, just in case. They didn't officially modify their turrets. They didn't tell maintenance crews what they were planning. They just made sure they had the means to remove those bolts if they ever needed to. The first documented use of McGee's technique after his capture came on July 2, 1944, during a raid on an oil refinery near Budapest, Hungary. Staff Sergeant Robert Chun, a ball turret gunner with the 15th Air Force flying out of Italy, found his turret jammed after a fighter attack damaged the rotation mechanism. His B-17 was losing altitude with 2 engines out and the pilot had ordered bailout. Chun remembered hearing about a POW who had escaped a jammed turret by removing bolts. He didn't know if the story was true or exaggerated. He didn't care. He pulled out his survival knife and a small adjustable wrench he'd started carrying after hearing the story. He located the 3 bolts facing the fuselage, removed them in under 4 minutes, and forced the hatch frame open. He escaped through the improvised opening and parachuted safely. His crew survived. When they returned to base 3 days later after evading through partisan territory, Chun reported what he had done to his squadron intelligence officer. The report should have triggered an investigation. Modifying aircraft in the field without authorization was a court-martial offense. Removing structural bolts from a turret installation violated multiple technical orders. But the intelligence officer was a former engineer who understood what Chun had done and why it worked. He also understood that this technique could save lives. He filed the report but marked it for technical review rather than disciplinary action. That report went to 15th Air Force headquarters where it sat in an inbox for 2 weeks. Then on July 18th, another jammed turret incident occurred. This time the gunner didn't know about the bolt removal technique. He died when his bomber crashed near Vienna. The intelligence officer who had filed Chen's report heard about the death and made a decision. He couldn't officially authorize the modification, but he could make sure the information spread. He wrote up a detailed description of Chen's escape method and distributed it informally to squadron intelligence officers across 15th Air Force with a note suggesting they might want to share this information with their ball turret gunners. By August 1944, the technique was spreading through both 8th and 15th Air Forces via unofficial channels. Crew chiefs mentioned it to gunners during pre-flight checks. Armorer sergeants demonstrated which bolts to target. Experienced gunners showed new replacements where to carry tools and how to position them for quick access. Nobody called it official procedure. Nobody put it in writing in maintenance logs. It was just information passed between men who understood that survival sometimes required breaking rules. The technique acquired a nickname among crews, the McGee method, named after the man who had pioneered it even though most gunners didn't know his full name or that he was still alive in a German POW camp. Some called it the emergency hatch mod. Others called it the 3-bolt trick. The terminology varied but the procedure was consistent. Remove the 3 bolts facing the fuselage, force the hatch frame inward, squeeze through the opening. Boeing and Sperry engineers would have been horrified if they had known. The bolts were structural components. Removing them compromised the turret's ability to withstand the stresses of flight, particularly the aerodynamic loads when the aircraft maneuvered or when the turret rotated at high speed. In theory, a turret missing 3 structural bolts could fail catastrophically. The hatch frame could tear away, the turret could disintegrate, the gunner could be sucked out into the slipstream. Boeing's engineering analysis, conducted post-war, calculated that removing 3 bolts reduced structural integrity by 38% and created a failure risk during high-G maneuvers. But that analysis assumed normal flight operations. The McGee method was never used during normal operations. It was used when the aircraft was already dying, when structural integrity was already compromised by battle damage, when the choice was between a 38% risk of turret failure and a 100% certainty of death in a crash. The first confirmed save using the McGee method in 8th Air Force came on August 12, 1944. Staff Sergeant James Kowalski, flying with the 398th Bomb Group out of Nut Hampstead, found his turret jammed during a mission to bomb German tank concentrations near Falaise, France. His B-17 had taken flak damage that severed electrical power to the turret and jammed the manual rotation mechanism. When the pilot ordered bailout after a second engine failure, Kowalski had approximately 3 minutes to escape. He used the McGee method, removing 3 bolts with a combination wrench and screwdriver, forced the hatch frame open and escaped. His bomber crashed 40 seconds after he jumped. Kowalski's crew chief documented the escape in a personal log but didn't report it through official channels. He knew that acknowledging the modification would raise questions about who had authorized it. Instead, he quietly passed the story to other crew chiefs. Word spread through the maintenance community that the technique worked and could be done quickly if the gunner had the right tools and knew what to do. By September 1944, an estimated 200 to 300 ball turret gunners across the 8th and 15th Air Forces were carrying the tools necessary to execute the McGee method if needed. Most would never need to use it. Jam turrets requiring emergency escape were relatively rare, occurring in perhaps 2 to 3% of damaged aircraft. But those rare situations were the difference between life and death. Between August and October 1944, 8 confirmed escapes using the McGee method were documented in personal logs, crew debriefs, and intelligence reports. 8 men who would have died in crashes or explosions instead came home alive. Their survival wasn't random luck. It was the result of information sharing, preparation, and a willingness to break rules when rules meant death. The technique was being refined through practice and experience. Early users discovered that the bolts could be pre-loosened before missions, unscrewed just enough that they could be removed by hand quickly, but still tight enough to maintain structural integrity during normal flight. This modification cut escape time from 4 minutes to under 2 minutes. Crew chiefs started doing this pre-loosening informally during pre-flight inspections. They would use a wrench to back each of the 3 critical bolts out by 1 full turn, then apply a drop of safety wire to prevent them from vibrating loose during flight. The safety wire would break easily under hand pressure, allowing the gunner to unscrew the bolts quickly if necessary. This modification was completely unauthorized and violated multiple technical orders. If an inspector had discovered it, the crew chief would have faced disciplinary action. But inspectors rarely checked ball turret bolts specifically. They checked control surfaces, engines, ammunition loads, critical flight systems. A few bolts that were slightly loose but still secured didn't register as a priority concern. The pre-loosening technique spread through the maintenance community the same way the escape technique spread through gunners. Whispered conversations, quiet demonstrations, shared knowledge that existed outside official channels. By October 1944, the modification had become so widespread that it was affecting turret reliability statistics. Boeing's field service representatives began noticing an unusual trend. Ball turret hatch frames were showing increased wear patterns consistent with repeated stress loading, but not corresponding with normal rotation cycles. Several turrets returned for depot-level maintenance showed evidence of bolts having been removed and reinstalled multiple times. The wear patterns suggested the bolts had been taken out and put back in repeatedly, not just once during manufacturing or major overhaul. Boeing engineers couldn't figure out why maintenance crews would be removing structural bolts. The field service reports noted the anomaly but didn't trigger any investigation. The turrets were still functioning. The wear wasn't causing failures. It was just unusual. What Boeing didn't know was that crew chiefs were practicing the removal procedure, teaching it to gunners, and occasionally testing it during post-flight inspections to verify it could be done quickly enough to matter. The technique reached its ultimate test during the massive daylight raids of late 1944. On October 7th, The 8th Air Force launched its largest single-day mission of the war, more than 1,400 bombers attacking oil and industrial targets across Germany. The mission encountered heavy resistance. German fighters and flak batteries were concentrated for maximum defense. The 8th Air Force lost 40 bombers that day, one of the highest single-day losses of the strategic bombing campaign. Among those losses were 3 aircraft where ball turret gunners successfully used the McGee method to escape from jam turrets before their bombers crashed. One of those gunners was Staff Sergeant Michael Romano of the 306th Bomb Group. Romano's B-17 was hit by flak over Kassel, Germany. The hit severed hydraulic lines and jammed the turret in an awkward position with the hatch facing 60 degrees off vertical. Romano had pre-loosened his critical bolts before the mission. When the pilot gave the bailout order, Romano removed all 3 bolts in 90 seconds, forced the hatch frame open, and escaped through the improvised opening. He landed safely and evaded capture for 2 days before reaching American lines. His debrief was the first official report that explicitly described the pre-loosening modification and recommended it as standard procedure. Romano's debrief landed on the desk of Colonel Curtis LeMay, who commanded the 3rd Air Division of the 8th Air Force. LeMay was known for his analytical approach to bombing operations and his willingness to adopt tactical innovations that saved lives. He read Romano's account and immediately recognized its significance. He called in Boeing's senior field service representative and Sperry's liaison engineer to discuss the modification. Both men were initially skeptical. Removing structural bolts violated design specifications. Pre-loosening them was even worse from an engineering standpoint. But LeMay didn't care about design specifications. He cared about crew survival rates. He asked one question: does this technique work? The answer, based on documented cases, was yes. LeMay made a decision that would later be called one of the most pragmatic engineering compromises of the war. He wouldn't officially authorize the modification. That would require approval from Army Air Force Headquarters, Boeing, and Sperry, a process that could take months. But he wouldn't prohibit it either. He issued a verbal directive to his group commanders. If ball turret gunners were pre-loosening bolts and carrying tools for emergency escape, maintenance officers should look the other way. LeMay's unofficial authorization changed everything. Group commanders passed the word to squadron commanders who passed it to crew chiefs and gunners. The McGee method was no longer something you did in secret and hoped nobody found out. It was tacitly approved unofficial procedure. Crew chiefs stopped worrying about court-martial and started openly teaching the technique to new gunners during training. Armorer sergeants demonstrated proper tool positioning and bolt removal sequences. Some maintenance crews began pre-loosening the critical bolts as standard practice during pre-flight inspections. The modification remained technically unauthorized. There was no written technical order approving it, no official maintenance manual update. But everyone from group commanders down to crew chiefs understood that this was how things would be done. The unofficial nature of the approval actually worked in favor of wider adoption. Because there was no official paperwork, there was no bureaucratic process to slow implementation. The technique simply spread organically through the bomber groups. Between November 1944 and March 1945, as the strategic bombing campaign intensified, the McGee method saved an estimated 23 additional ball turret gunners from jam turret situations. The exact number is difficult to verify because many incidents weren't officially documented. When a gunner used the technique to escape and successfully bailed out, the aircraft crashed and burned. There was no wreckage to inspect, no turret to examine for bolt removal evidence. The only documentation came from the gunner's debrief after he returned to base or was liberated from POW camps. Some of these debriefs mentioned the escape method explicitly. Others simply noted that the gunner had managed to exit despite turret malfunction, without specifying how. Post-war research by Air Force historians identified at least 47 documented cases where gunners explicitly reported using bolt removal to escape jam turrets between March 1944 and May 1945. The actual number was likely higher, possibly 60 to 70 cases, but documentation is incomplete. The technique also had unexpected secondary benefits. Several gunners reported using the McGee method not for emergency escape, but to exit jam turrets after successful landings. In at least 8 documented cases, B-17s returned to base with battle damage that included jammed ball turrets. Rather than waiting hours for ground crews to cut the turret open with torches, the gunner simply removed the 3 bolts, pushed the hatch frame open, and climbed out. This saved time, reduced risk of injury from cutting operations, and meant the gunner didn't have to endure hours trapped in the cramped sphere waiting for extraction. These non-emergency uses of the technique further demonstrated its practical value and helped normalize it as accepted procedure even though it remained officially unauthorized. Crew chiefs began keeping the 3 critical bolts slightly loose as standard practice, knowing that if the turret jammed even on the ground, the gunner could self-extract quickly. Boeing engineers became aware of the widespread modification by early 1945 but chose not to issue any prohibition. The war in Europe was clearly entering its final months. The strategic bombing campaign had achieved most of its objectives. Forcing a redesign or issuing technical orders prohibiting a modification that was saving lives made no practical sense. Boeing's official position was to acknowledge that field modifications were occurring but to neither approve nor explicitly prohibit them. This bureaucratic non-stance allowed the technique to continue spreading without triggering formal investigations or disciplinary actions. Sperry Corporation, which manufactured the turrets, took a similar position. Their engineers privately admitted that the modification, while technically compromising structural specifications, appeared to work without causing catastrophic failures. The company issued no formal statement but quietly updated their post-war turret designs to include an emergency egress mechanism that incorporated some of McGee's principles. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The strategic bombing campaign concluded. B-17s were gradually phased out of frontline service, replaced by B-29s for operations against Japan. The ball turret itself became obsolete as jet fighters and improved defensive systems made the position unnecessary. But the principles McGee had discovered, that emergency escape systems should prioritize speed over structural perfection, that field modifications could improve survival rates, that rules should bend when lives were at stake. Those principles influenced post-war aircraft design. The B-29 incorporated escape systems that could be activated quickly without requiring complex procedures. The B-36 and later bombers included emergency hatches with quick-release mechanisms. Modern military aircraft have ejection seats with single-action activation. The evolution from wait for ground crew rescue to every crew member can self-extract in seconds traces a direct line back to the innovations that bomber crews developed in combat when official procedures weren't adequate. Alan Magee himself didn't learn about the widespread adoption of his technique until after the war ended. He spent 14 months as a prisoner of war at Stalag Luft 4 in Poland, surviving harsh conditions and forced evacuation marches as Soviet forces advanced from the east. He was liberated in May 1945 by British forces and returned to the United States in June. During his repatriation debriefing, intelligence officers asked him about his escape from the jam turret. Magee described the bolt removal method in detail, assuming it was a routine after-action report. The debriefing officer interrupted him mid-description and told him that dozens of gunners had used his technique to escape jam turrets throughout the final year of the war. Magee was stunned. He had improvised a desperate solution while his bomber was falling. He never imagined it would become widespread procedure. The officer showed him documentation of known cases, gunners who had explicitly cited the Magee method in their debriefs, crew chiefs who had taught it to new crews, even a memo from Colonel LeMay's staff acknowledging the modification. Magee's reaction was characteristically modest. He told the debriefing officer that he was glad if his experience had helped others survive, but emphasized that any gunner would have done the same thing in his situation. Necessity had driven innovation, not genius. He was right, but he was also underselling the significance of what he had discovered. Plenty of gunners had been trapped in jam turrets before March 1944. None of them had thought to remove structural bolts to create an improvised escape hatch. Most had either died in crashes or survived through luck. Turrets that unjammed at the last moment, aircraft that crashed survivably, miraculous circumstances. Magee had looked at an impossible situation and found a solution that contradicted every engineering specification but worked anyway. That kind of creative problem-solving under extreme stress was exactly what kept men alive in combat. The fact that his solution then spread through informal networks to save dozens of others was testament to how quickly practical innovations could propagate when survival was at stake. The post-war analysis of the McGee method revealed some interesting statistics that only became apparent when researchers compiled all the documented cases. Of the 47 confirmed uses of the technique, 44 resulted in successful escapes. 3 gunners attempted the bolt removal but were unable to force the hatch frame open before their aircraft crashed. The 93.6% success rate was extraordinary considering these were worst-case scenarios. Jam turrets in damaged aircraft with seconds remaining before impact. For comparison, the survival rate for gunners trapped in jam turrets before March 1944 was approximately 12%. And those survivors had escaped through luck or circumstance rather than deliberate action. The McGee method increased survival probability by more than 7 times. That statistical impact, multiplied across dozens of cases, translated to roughly 40 lives saved that would have been lost under previous procedures. The technique also had broader implications for how the military thought about equipment design and field modifications. Before World War II, military equipment was designed by engineers, tested under controlled conditions, and deployed with strict instructions against unauthorized modifications. This approach made sense for maintaining standardization and preventing dangerous improvisations. But combat revealed that standardized solutions couldn't account for every situation. Sometimes the field manual was wrong. Sometimes equipment needed to be modified to work in conditions the designers hadn't anticipated. The challenge was distinguishing between useful modifications that improved safety and dangerous modifications that compromised it. The McGee method illustrated this perfectly. It violated design specifications but increased survival rates. Post-war military doctrine began incorporating concepts of adaptive modification, acknowledging that combat units needed flexibility to adjust equipment based on operational experience. The Korean War provided an unexpected validation of McGee's principles when B-29 gunners encountered similar turret jamming issues. The B-29 used different turret designs than the B-17, but the fundamental problem remained. A gunner trapped in a rotating turret that wouldn't rotate. Several B-29 gunners in Korea had served in B-17 units during World War II or had been trained by veterans who knew the McGee method. When turrets jammed, these gunners adapted the bolt removal technique to their different turret configurations. The exact procedure varied because B-29 turrets had different structural designs, but the principle was identical. Identify which structural elements could be removed to create an emergency opening, prepare the tools necessary, and be ready to execute under pressure. At least 3 documented B-29 turret escapes in Korea used adaptations of the McGee method, proving that the core concept translated across different aircraft generations. The legacy of the McGee method extends far beyond the specific technique of removing 3 bolts from a ball turret. It represents a fundamental shift in how military organizations think about the relationship between engineering specifications, operational procedures, and combat necessity. The official maintenance manual said jam turrets were inescapable without ground crew assistance. Combat reality said that procedure would result in unnecessary deaths. The solution emerged not from headquarters or engineering departments, but from a 20-year-old machinist trapped in a falling bomber with seconds to live. His innovation spread through unofficial channels because formal approval would have taken too long and might never have come at all. This pattern, frontline innovation adopted through informal networks while official channels remained silent, characterized many of the most effective tactical adaptations of World War II. It wasn't unique to ball turret escapes. It happened with tank tactics, infantry weapons modifications, and aircraft maintenance procedures throughout the war. McGee returned to civilian life in 1945 and never sought recognition for his technique. He worked as a machinist in New Jersey for 40 years, married, raised 3 children, and rarely spoke about his wartime experiences. When researchers contacted him in the 1980s for oral history projects, he was reluctant to discuss the ball turret escape. He emphasized that he had simply done what any trapped person would do: look for a way out. He deflected credit to the crew chiefs who taught the technique to others, the intelligence officers who documented it, and the commanders who allowed it to spread despite its unauthorized status. This humility was characteristic of his generation. They had done what needed to be done without expecting praise or recognition. But McGee's contribution was significant precisely because it wasn't just about his own survival. The technique he pioneered saved dozens of men who never met him, never knew his name, but benefited from his desperate improvisation on March 12, 1944. The documented impact tells the story clearly. 47 confirmed escapes between March 1944 and May 1945. 44 successful evacuations. An estimated 300 to 500 additional gunners prepared to use the technique if needed, carrying tools and pre-loosening bolts on every mission. The psychological impact of knowing you had an escape option, even from a jammed turret, affected crew morale and combat effectiveness. Ball turret gunners who knew about the McGee method were statistically more likely to volunteer for additional missions according to post-war analysis of crew rotation records. The knowledge that survival was possible even in worst-case scenarios reduced the psychological burden of climbing into the turret each mission. This confidence translated to better gunnery performance, faster reaction times, and improved crew coordination. The tangible impact was 44 lives saved directly. The intangible impact was thousands of missions flown by gunners who believed they could survive even mechanical failure. Modern aircraft design incorporates the lessons learned from innovations like the McGee method. Emergency egress systems are designed with redundancy, simplicity, and speed as priorities. Fighter jet ejection seats can be activated with a single motion. Transport aircraft have multiple emergency exits with quick-release mechanisms. Helicopter crews have jettisoning systems for doors and windows. The engineering philosophy has shifted from build it strong enough that it never fails to build it strong enough for normal operations, but include emergency procedures for when it does fail. This philosophy directly contradicts the pre-war approach that said equipment should be so well designed that emergency procedures weren't necessary. Combat experience proved that perfect reliability was impossible. What mattered was giving crews options when equipment failed. The McGee method was an early example of this adaptive philosophy. Official procedures were inadequate, so a combat-tested alternative was developed and adopted despite violating design specifications. Alan Magee died in 2003 at age 79 in New Jersey. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service and noted that he had survived being shot down over Germany. It did not mention the escape technique or the lives it saved. Most of the men Magee had indirectly saved never knew his name. They knew about the 3-bolt trick or the emergency hatch mod, but not about the machinist from New Jersey who had improvised it while his bomber fell. That anonymity is fitting in a way. The McGee method wasn't about one man's heroism. It was about distributed problem-solving under pressure, information sharing through informal networks, and the willingness of combat units to adopt innovations that worked regardless of whether they had official approval. Magee provided the initial breakthrough, but hundreds of crew chiefs, gunners, intelligence officers, and commanders contributed to refining and spreading the technique. It was collective innovation driven by survival necessity. The ball turret itself is now a historical artifact. The last operational Sperry A2 turret was removed from service in the early 1950s. Several are preserved in museums, including the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, where visitors can see the cramped space and understand why escape from a jammed turret seemed impossible. But none of those preserved turrets show evidence of the McGee method. The 3 critical bolts are all in place, properly torqued, exactly as Sperry engineers designed them. You won't find documentation on the museum placard about gunners removing those bolts in flight or crew chiefs pre-loosening them before missions. That history exists in personal logbooks, declassified debriefs, and the memories of veterans who are no longer here to tell the stories. The technique that saved 44 lives is largely forgotten except by historians who study tactical innovation and veterans who remember hearing about it from the men who used it. But the principles Magee discovered, that emergency procedures should prioritize survival over design specifications, that field innovations can spread faster than official modifications, that sometimes breaking rules is how you stay alive, those principles remain embedded in military doctrine and aircraft design today. Magee's legacy isn't his name on a memorial or a medal on a wall. His legacy is 44 men who came home to families, had children, built lives they would never have lived if Magee hadn't figured out how to remove 3 bolts while his bomber fell. Those 44 men had descendants, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, Lives that exist because a 20-year-old machinist refused to accept that a jammed turret meant certain death. That's the real legacy. Not the technique itself, but the lives it saved and all the lives that came after.